Hi everyone, this is William with the Grand Duke Dmitri video series. We're not doing a diary entry today. I'm coming at you actually from 1935, the 12th of June 1935 in Paris. A brief recap. Well, in the last 1930s video, we had the last part, the conclusion of the Candide article, and that is significant for today. Of course, it was more than 3 years later, and Dmitri had to do a little bit of rehabilitation for himself, very slight, but since he'd gotten so actively involved with Young Russia in 1935, becoming the chairman of the board and becoming the head of the sports section of the organization, he had taken a fairly pro-Soviet stance on things. And you'll see in this particular speech why some people were worried that he'd become kind of a fellow traveler. And in December 1938, he was, having to refute that he was ever a fellow traveler, and that he had ever been impressed by Stalin, and he said in the interview that he'd seen right through Stalin from the beginning. And he, mentioned, as he certainly does not here, the kind of genocidal famine in the Ukraine, and that it was an atrocity. And he's not there yet in 1935. So this is interesting, and I hope you'll enjoy it. The thread of continuity is that it's still so important to him to present himself as a Russian patriot, and indeed he was a Russian patriot, I don't doubt that. In 1915, the video from yesterday, we had a lot of sledding and a lot of reading of this very interesting book on the mystical path. Our cast today, no specific person. He was addressing this assembly of Young Russia members in general. And the name of the speeches for 1935 and 1936 were published in a volume that I found at the British Library. It's the only place I've ever come across it, although I'm sure it exists elsewhere. And the name of the speech was "Towards a Young Russia!" exclamation point, and then ellipses, ... So the emphasis, as you will see, is very much on the future, and that was the case with Dmitri going all the way back to after the revolution, when he wanted to emphasize that we must be focused on Russia's future, and grew so frustrated in 1921 in particular with members of the emigration who sat around and talked about the sort of pie-in-the-sky idea of returning Russia, once the Bolsheviks fell, of returning Russia to just simply the status quo before the revolution, without the war, of course. Okay, so picture Dmitri standing up in an auditorium and giving this speech to mostly young people. 12th June 1935. Today, for the first time, I see the young Russians of the 1st District in France, whom I have called together to mark the creation of the sports organization. A month ago, the head told me about his wish that this new organization should come under my direct supervision. I'm going to make one note here. All right, I welcome this new undertaking wholeheartedly. I've loved sports since childhood and participated in many different kinds, including international competitions. I'm sorry, I should have made my notes ahead of time. Including international competitions, I was brought up in the tradition of sportsmanship. Not to be proud when you're lucky enough to win, and not to blame anyone but yourself if someone turns out to be better than you. But the creation of the sports section itself is actually much less important than the task of bringing young people into the Young Russia organization, young people who are not closely connected either to the ideology or the practice of the movement. It's already been 12 years since I first became closely associated with you, young Russians, and especially in the last 4 years, I've become more and more involved with your work. All of us, from Paris to the Far East, from the Baltic region to South America, live and burn with one spirit, one thought, love for Russia. But our patriotism should not merely be an attachment to the past. It should be the living patriotism of the present and the future, striving for everything that will lead to the revival and aggrandizement of our country. Every accomplishment that takes place in Russia in our own day, whether in sports, technology, science, art, or military affairs, as far as I'm concerned, those are Russian accomplishments and not the accomplishments of the Third International. For example, the construction of the world's largest airplane, built by Russian hands, based on Russian technology, designed by Russian engineers. For me, it's a source of national pride, and the demise of that machine not only cannot be a cause for gloating, but is a very grave blow to Russian self-esteem. Patriotism, i.e. love for the fatherland under any political system, making one note. Okay, love for the fatherland under any political system does not necessarily mean acquiescence to those in whose hands power is held. No matter how odious the current regime may be, no one can stop me from loving Russia as Russia. I am sometimes forced to hear unbelievable things. Okay, I'm going to stop there because I want to focus on those unbelievable things instead of tacking them on at the end. All right, so just to clarify, when Dmitri refers to the head, he's talking about Kazanbek, who was the founder of the Young Russia Party. And so he will have a different word, different designation for Kirill, who was very much involved in Young Russia. Okay, so when he tells us that he'd loved sports since childhood, that he'd participated in many different kinds of sports, that he'd been in international competition, well, that is referring to the Olympic Games of 1912. He was indeed a competitor for Russia in the Olympics, equestrian. And when he tells us that he was taught, that he was brought up in a tradition of sportsmanship where you blamed yourself if you performed badly, then we know that's true. We know that's absolutely true. He did not blame other people when he lost. He wasn't a hothead when he lost. So, this is not an example like when he told the journalist from Candide that he had fought against the Turks, which was complete nonsense. This that he's telling these young people about himself is absolutely true. Okay, now it's interesting. He tells us he was already involved, or rather closely associated with Young Russia 12 years ago. So that would make it 1923. So the organization was just starting to come together in 1921. It wasn't even on the radar screen yet for Dmitri, but it was, the reason 1923 was because that was when Kirill asked Dmitri, even after all the enmity that had existed between them and that would later exist between Dmitri and Vladimir. Nonetheless, in 1923, Kirill kind of threw Dmitri a sop and said, well, you can be in charge of my imperial what's the word, court, or whatever you would call it, organization in Paris. So that was Dmitri's official role within the chancellery of Grand Duke Kirill, who had now proclaimed himself the emperor in exile. And because Kirill backed this organization of Young Russia, Dmitri was associated with it, but wasn't very actively involved with it. So, as he says, his more active involvement started in about 1931. So it was before his divorce with Audrey, and this is also before his divorce with Audrey. And she went with him to some of these speeches and rallies. But yeah, anyway, so we get some insight. Why 1931? I'm not sure. There's not a diary for that year, unfortunately, so I don't have the details on that. Here again, this is an attitude and a principle that Dimitri's had since the very earliest years, when he says that patriotism is not merely an attachment to the past. It is meant for something living and something with a future, and I give him credit for that, because I agree with that in my day and age as well. So what does he refer to when he's talking about the world's largest airplane? Well, it was, he was right. Russia did build the world's largest airplane. It was the Tupolev ANT-20, and this particular one, the first one, had been given the name Maxim Gorky. So here's what I'm quoting now from the Google AI. The ANT-20's primary purpose was to function as a propaganda aircraft, showcasing Soviet achievements and promoting communism throughout the Soviet Union. The ANT-20 Maxim Gorky crashed on May 18, 1935, during a demonstration flight over Moscow, when a fighter plane performing aerobatics found around it collided with the larger aircraft. The accident resulted in the deaths of 45 people, including the fighter pilot, the ANT-20's crew and passengers, and 9 people on the ground. A replacement, the ANT-20 BIS, was built and used for transport, but it also crashed in 1942 due to a pilot allowing a passenger to take the controls, leading to an accidental disengagement of the autopilot and a subsequent nosedive. So that's interesting, because I knew about the crash of the plane, but I didn't know how stupid the circumstances were. My God, the plane was apparently viable. It was just the people operating it and the people around it that caused these problems. Anyway, so we have 18th May 1935. Dmitri is giving this speech on the 12th of June, so it had not been quite a month. And the thing about it is that apparently Russian emigres, some of them, had been gloating over it. Look, they tried to build the Soviets tried to build the world's biggest plane, but it crashed. And Dmitri is saying, no, I'm proud of all of the technological accomplishments of this in the Soviet Union, and this I consider a very grave blow to Russian self-esteem. Okay, I don't really need to repeat his words, because he puts it very clearly. And it's interesting that it was really built for propaganda purposes, because, you know, in that respect, aside from the loss of life, you can kind of see the point of the people who were kind of gloating over it, because it was built to, well, as the AI puts it, it was built to showcase Soviet achievements and promote communism throughout the Soviet Union. Dmitri didn't want to promote communism, that's for sure. But he is on board with showcasing the Soviet achievements, because as far as he's concerned, they're Russian achievements. Okay, interesting, his use of fatherland instead of the more common Rodina, which is motherland. Yeah. So love for the fatherland under any political system does not necessarily mean acquiescence to those in whose hands power is held. Okay, so he calls the current regime odious, but he's saying that he's giving them a little wiggle room. Okay, it doesn't necessarily mean acquiescence to them, but as we know from previous things that he said, he was willing to, or in things that he'd say as part of Young Russia, he was willing to accept that some of the ideas of the Soviets would need to be incorporated in the government of a future Russia. Okay, so that's the end. This remark about unbelievable things that he's heard, which we'll go on to hear about, he'll go on to speak about. What do we have next time? When we go back to 1915, we have some visitors from the Golitsyn family. We have two ladies, Balashova and Barasova, both apparently vying for Dmitri's attention, or that's putting it too strongly. Both of them he'd been sweet-talking, and they were both responding. Okay, 1935, when we return to that, of course, we will have the unbelievable things, and we'll hear what Dmitri has to say about Kirill, how he presents Kirill specifically to these young people gathered at the Young Russia rally. All right, I hope you enjoyed this one, and I hope to see you next time. Bye.